At 7:30 in the morning on September 16th, 1992, the British government made a public announcement. The pound would hold. The Bank of England would defend it with everything the state had. There was nothing to worry about. At that exact moment, George Soros was already selling 10 billion pounds he did not own. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. He had borrowed the money, converted it into other currencies, and was dumping it into the market in volumes so large that the Bank of England's trading desk initially could not process what they were seeing. One man, one fund, one bet placed in complete silence against the economic policy of an entire country. The British government had no idea, and by the time they understood what was happening, the trap had already closed. What followed in the next 14 hours was not a war in any conventional sense. No weapons, no threats, no laws broken, just a man with a position, a phone, and a level of cold conviction so absolute that he was willing to risk more money than most nations hold in reserve on a single idea. The idea was simple. The British government was lying to its own people about the strength of the pound, and markets, unlike governments, cannot lie indefinitely. By midnight, Britain had surrendered. The pound collapsed. The UK exited the European exchange rate mechanism in a state of public humiliation that the government would spend years trying to explain. Soros made $1.1 billion before dinner, and the most disturbing part of this story is not the number. It is how completely alone he was when he did it. George Soros was not a genius in the way that word is normally used. He was not faster than everyone else. He was not working with information nobody else had. Every number he used to build his case against the pound was publicly available. The problem was not access to information. The problem was that everyone who had the information was too afraid to believe what it was telling them. Soros was not afraid. He had grown up in Budapest during the Nazi occupation, survived by using false documents, watched a functional society collapse into something unrecognizable inside of months. What he took from that experience was not trauma in the conventional sense. It was a permanent, bone-deep understanding that institutions which appear unshakable can fail completely and with stunning speed once the pressure behind the surface becomes visible to enough people simultaneously. He carried that understanding into finance, and in 1992, he looked at the British pound and saw exactly that pattern. The UK had entered the European exchange rate mechanism in 1990, locking the pound to the German mark at a rate that required British interest rates to track German ones. The problem was that the German economy was booming after reunification, while the British economy was in recession. The same interest rate was strangling Britain and fueling Germany simultaneously. Every economist in London understood this. Every trader on every desk understood this. The British government understood this. But governments do not admit when their own policy is destroying their own people. They hold the line and hope the pressure disappears. Soros simply decided to be the pressure that made it impossible to hold. Most people hear the phrase shorting a currency and assume it requires some exotic financial instrument available only to insiders. It does not. The mechanics are straightforward enough that once you understand them, you will never look at a government's economic announcements the same way again. Here is exactly what Soros did. He went to major banks and borrowed 10 billion British pounds. The banks were happy to lend. He immediately sold every pound he had borrowed, converting them into German marks and American dollars. This act alone began pushing the pound's value downward. He then waited. The logic was brutally simple. If the pound held its value, he would buy back the pounds at the same price, return them to the banks, and lose only the borrowing fees. A manageable loss. But if the pound fell, which he was certain it would, he could buy back those same 10 billion pounds at a significantly lower price, return them to the banks, and keep the difference. He was not gambling. He was exploiting a mathematical certainty that the British government had locked itself into and could not escape without political humiliation. And then he did something that transformed a large bet into an unstoppable force. He told other traders what he was doing, not secretly, openly. He let the market know that Quantum Fund was short 10 billion pounds. Other funds looked at his reasoning, looked at the same public data he had used, and began shorting the pound themselves. Within hours, the selling pressure was not coming from one fund. It was coming from dozens. The Bank of England was no longer fighting George Soros. It was fighting the entire market simultaneously. That is not a battle any government has ever won. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the Bank of England began buying pounds. This is the standard defensive move. You support your currency by purchasing it in volume, signaling to the market that the state has the resources and the will to hold the line. They spent £1 billion in the first hour. The exchange rate barely moved. By 10 o'clock, the selling pressure was so intense that the Bank of England was consuming its entire foreign currency reserve at a rate that its own officials described afterward as watching water pour through their hands. They called the Treasury. The Treasury called the Prime Minister. An emergency meeting was convened in Downing Street, while traders across London, Frankfurt, and New York watched their screens and understood with complete clarity that the British government was losing in real time. At 11 o'clock, the government announced it was raising interest rates from 10% to 12% effective immediately. This was an extraordinary move. Raising rates that aggressively in a single morning signals one thing to every market participant simultaneously: panic. The pound continued falling. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they raised rates again to 15%. In a single day, the British government had imposed the highest interest rates in modern peacetime history on its own population, on their mortgages, on their businesses, on their savings, in a desperate attempt to make holding pounds attractive enough to stop the bleeding. Soros did not sell a single pound back. He sat in Manhattan and watched. At 7:30 that evening, Britain surrendered. The announcement came quietly. The UK was suspending its membership in the European exchange rate mechanism with immediate effect. Every trader in the world understood what that meant. The government had just admitted, publicly and permanently, that one man had been right and they had been wrong. Britain never fully recovered its political credibility on economic matters that decade. The conservative government that had staked its entire identity on membership in the exchange rate mechanism collapsed in slow motion over the following years, losing the next election by the largest margin in modern British history. Soros became the most famous trader alive, not because people admired him, because he had demonstrated something that governments across the world could not afford to ignore. A sufficiently capitalized private actor with a correct analysis could overpower the economic policy of a sovereign nation without breaking a single law. The state, for all its armies and institutions and democratic mandates, was structurally vulnerable to anyone who understood its own numbers better than it did. After 1992, the rules of global finance changed permanently. Countries began abandoning fixed exchange rates. Central banks restructured their reserve strategies. Entire academic frameworks for understanding currency stability were rewritten around the lesson of one September afternoon in London. But the deeper lesson was never officially acknowledged, because acknowledging it would require governments to admit something deeply uncomfortable: that economic policy built on political necessity rather than mathematical reality will always eventually meet someone willing to bet against it. And that person does not need an army. They need a phone, a prime broker, and the willingness to be right, while everyone powerful insists they are wrong. If you watch this far, you now understand how a single person legally broke an entire country's economy in one afternoon. Subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments, which country today do you think is most vulnerable to exactly this kind of attack? The best answer gets a full breakdown in the next video.